Hi guy, welcome back TV spoilers. Victor had learned long ago that victory often begins with what other people dismiss as meaningless, a fleeting glance, a silence that lingers a second too long, a detail left behind in a conversation that was never meant to matter. But this time, what made him stop wasn't a careless slip of the tongue or an operational mistake. It was that chilling sensation crawling up his spine, the realization that a crack had opened right in front of him, wide enough to drag a buried secret back into daylight. Victor didn't need to try very hard to see that everything happening lately shared the same dangerous pattern. Matt was still out there somewhere, hiding like a wounded animal that refused to die. Nick was carrying a secret inside him like a loaded weapon he wasn't sure he could keep from firing. And Jack was always the kind of man people leaned on, until they suddenly discovered the pillar could break. Victor never forgot that. He never forgot anything. And he certainly didn't forget that any deal between Nick and Jack, if it was as real as his instincts insisted, would just be a mistake his son made. It would be a fracture inside the Newman family itself, the very structure Victor had spent his whole life building with absolute control. Sienna entered the story like a strange variable, like a needle brushing a thread that was already stretched to the point of snapping. Victor was not the kind of man who believed in coincidence. He studied Sienna with the eyes of someone who had spent decades watching the world reveal its true rule. Everything has a price, and people are usually the most expensive thing of all. He didn't care whether Sienna was good or bad in the simplistic way others like to judge. What mattered was where she stood on the board, and which pieces she could move with what she knew. Sienna didn't speak much, but that restraint only sharpened Victor's focus. The people who hide the most are often the ones who say the least. And when Victor happened to brush against the lead Sienna was guarding, he understood immediately that she wasn't holding one small secret about Matt. She was holding a piece of truth large enough to make a man like Victor change his strategy in a single breath. The most terrifying part was this: Sienna knew exactly how valuable her knowledge was. Victor began connecting the dots with the ruthless instincts of a predator. If Sienna had information about where Matt was hiding, then Matt had left a trace somewhere. There was a channel of communication no one else had detected. And if there was a channel, then Matt was building his defenses the only way a man like him could survive, through information trades, purchase loyalty, and alliances no one would ever suspect. Victor understood men like Matt. Matt didn't survive through strength. He survived through manipulation. And he wouldn't just today, he would prepare to strike. He would wait for the exact moment both the Newmans and the Abbotts were distracted, then land a blow that left them too stunned to respond. That was why Nick's secret dealings with Jack suddenly became more than troubling. They became a perfect weakness. Victor didn't even need to know every detail of the deal to feel he'd climb up his throat like rage trying to break free. Knowing that Nick had stepped into a space Victor couldn't control was enough. Nick could tell himself he was acting for the greater good, for the family's safety, for the chance to stop Matt before it was too late. But Victor knew his son better than that. Nick was always caught between the urge to do what felt right and the obsession to prove he wasn't just Victor's shadow. And that inner war made Nick dangerously easy to pull into something worse than he realized. In the days that followed, Victor didn't rush. He became terrifyingly quiet, the kind of quiet that made the air feel electrified, as the one wrong touch would detonate everything. He watched. He tested reactions. He asked questions that sounded harmless, then waited. Victor knew that people who carried secrets didn't fear exposure as much as they feared being understood. Nick began to feel uneasy under that silence. He was used to Victor attacking head-on with pressure, demands, and force. But Victor now felt like a locked door, and behind that door a plan was taking shape. Nick looked at him and couldn't read anything, and that absence of clarity tightened the fear in his chest. Deep down, Nick had always hoped he could handle things his own way without being crushed. Yet he also understood the brutal truth. No one played secret games inside the Newman family without paying for it. Sienna became the pressure point Victor wanted to close his fist around, but he didn't force her. He couldn't. People who hold information only surrender when they believe they're the ones controlling the game. Victor had to make Sienna feel powerful so she would reveal the true edge of what she knew. He approached her with cold, measured calm, the kind of authority that made the person in front of him want to run while also wanting to prove they weren't afraid. Sienna sensed Victor's danger immediately, but she also understood that without him, what she knew might get her killed even faster. Matt was not the type to forgive betrayal. Nick and Jack might be able to keep secrets, but they couldn't protect someone caught between the lines. Sienna was standing on a blade-thin wire, and one wrong step could send her falling. Victor didn't have to say out loud that he suspected something. The way he looked was enough for Sienna to know that whatever she hid would eventually be dragged into the open. And that created a different kind of pressure. Sienna began calculating. Should she reveal that Nick had Matt in some way? That Nick was connected to Matt's situation more directly than anyone suspected? Or should she hold it back because it might be the only card she could trade for her own safety? But the truth was darker than even that. Sienna wasn't holding just one secret. Victor sensed it like smoke before a fire. There was another shock buried underneath, something that wouldn't just lead Victor to Matt, but to the true nature of whatever bargain Nick and Jack had made. And if Victor's instincts were right, that bargain wasn't simply about catching Matt. It might have been about power, about silence, about who would fall so someone else could stay standing. The closer Victor moved toward the core truth, the colder his rage became. Not the kind that exploded, but the kind that compressed inside the ribs until it turned into ice. He hated being pushed outside the circle of control. He hated knowing someone was standing behind his family, shaping events like a game. And worst of all, he hated the possibility that Nick believed he was doing the right thing without realizing he was turning himself into a pawn either for Matt or for Jack. Victor always viewed the world through one rule: no one gives something for nothing. If Jack was making a deal with Nick, Jack would take something back. Leverage. Power. A weapon for the future. And if Matt was part of that equation, then Matt wasn't just hiding anymore. Matt was a living trap. Nick began feeling the cord tighten around his throat, even though no one had laid a hand on him yet. He repeated his reasons in his own mind, trying to convince himself he was acting for the greater good, that he wasn't betraying Victor, that he only wanted to handle Matt with minimal destruction. But the more Nick thought, the more he felt himself being stripped down by guilt. He knew Victor wouldn't look at this through the lens of good intentions. Victor only cared about outcome. And if the outcome was Nick standing on the same side as Jack, then Victor would call it betrayal no matter how Nick tried to dress it up. Nick couldn't bear that, but he also couldn't turn back. Once a deal begins, it becomes a door that can't close, and behind that door are consequences that can't be recalled. Nick didn't want to be the man who shattered his family, but he was standing exactly where one slip would bring everything down. On the other side, Jack wasn't breathing freely either. If there really was a secret bargain between him and Nick, then Jack was doing what he always did, gambling on strategy to keep the Abbott family standing through the storm. But this time, Jack wasn't only facing Victor. He was facing a man like Matt, someone who didn't fight for companies or honor, but for control and destruction. Jack understood that Matt wasn't a villain who needed to win, only needed everyone else to lose. That truth forced Jack to be even more careful. He knew Victor was getting close. He knew Victor would accept nothing less than total control. And Jack knew something else that twisted like a blade in his gut. If Victor discovered the deal, Victor would strike back. Not only against Jack, but against Nick, simply to send a message that no one inside the Newman family had the right to act alone. Jack didn't want Nick to be the casualty, but he couldn't pull away now. If he pulled away, Matt would exploit the vacuum and come after both families. Matt remained the longest shadow over everything, even without being seen. No one could spot him, but everyone felt him. He was the kind of threat that kept people awake at night because they didn't know when the knife would fall. Matt could be hiding in a tiny room, moving constantly, surviving through a network nobody had mapped. But the critical point was this: Matt was still thinking, still planning. And if Sienna truly held the lead to his hiding place, then Matt had slipped somewhere unless it was deliberate. That possibility only made Victor more dangerous. He didn't want to be lured into a place Matt had prepared to destroy him, in the literal or symbolic sense. Victor had to be certain every move he made was a blow against Matt, not a step into Matt's trap. Sienna became the pulse of the storm. She felt the tension rising in the air, like everyone was waiting for her mouth to open. But she also knew that speaking wasn't simple. If she gave Victor Matt's location, she might save herself from Matt, only to place herself under Victor's permanent control. If she exposed a deal between Nick and Jack, she would ignite a war inside these families, a war she couldn't predict anyone surviving. And if she stayed silent, she would be crushed between three forces: Matt, Nick, and Victor. Sienna understood then that what she held was no longer a secret. It was an explosive. And explosives don't wait for people to be ready. They only need a spark. Victor asked himself the question with brutal clarity. Could Sienna's intelligence help Nick? Or could it help Victor? He knew Nick would want to use it to end Matt, properly capture him, drag him into the light, finish the nightmare. But Victor wanted something else. Victor wanted annihilation. He wanted Matt erased from the board for good. And if Nick got in the way, Victor wouldn't hesitate. That was what made this so dangerous. One piece of information to completely different uses. In Nick's hands, it might become an attempt at salvation. In Victor's, it would become a weapon of domination. And in Jack's, it would become a shield for the Abbotts. Three paths, one secret, and at the end of every path, there was blood. Nick began to sense Victor had touched something. He could feel it in the way Victor moved differently, fewer questions, fewer reactions. But every glance at Nick felt like a calculation. Nick felt pinned beneath a spotlight, unable to hide the cracks in his eyes. He tried to appear normal, tried to smile, tried to talk about anything else. But the harder he tried, the more his fear exposed itself. Nick didn't fear Victor's anger as much as he feared Victor's disappointment, because anger could fade, but disappointment was an ending. Nick knew that if Victor believed Nick had betrayed him, Victor wouldn't just punish him. Victor would rewrite Nick's position in the family with a cold stroke of the pen, turning him into an outsider in his own home. Jack sensed the shift too. He knew Victor was smelling the secret now. Jack understood time was running out. If Victor struck before Jack could prepare, everything would shatter. Yet Jack couldn't act publicly, because acting publicly meant admitting the deal existed. Jack was trapped in a corner where every move cost him something. And that was exactly where Matt's true threat became visible. Matt didn't need to show his face. He only needed to make the others destroy each other. Jack started to see Matt's strategy clearly, like a spiderweb stretched across the dark. Matt only had to tug one strand, and the whole structure would tremble. And that strand might be Sienna. Sienna knew the decisive moment was coming. She felt it like the wind changing direction. Victor was about to act. Nick and Jack were standing too close to the edge. If she spoke, she would push one man down and save another. If she stayed silent, she might survive for minutes, only to die in hours. She held the choice no one had ever taught her how to make. And in that moment, the secret became heavy like stone, it because it was hard to say, but because it could kill. Victor looked at Sienna without pleading, without bargaining. Only certainty that he would get what he wanted, one way or another. Nick looked at her like she was a mirror reflecting his own guilt. Jack looked at her like she was a bridge so fragile it could carry them all across or sink them all into the river. And Matt, somewhere unseen, might have been waiting or controlling the entire thing like a master puppeteer. Just when it seemed everything was one sentence away, one nod away, one step away from breaking open, the air suddenly thickened, as though every window in the world had been sealed. Victor sensed something unnatural. Sienna wasn't simply afraid, she was weighing something larger. As if what she was about to reveal wasn't only where Matt was hiding. As if what she knew wasn't only the secret deal between Nick and Jack. As if there was another layer of truth beneath it all, darker and deeper. And if it surfaced, it would shatter everything they thought was unbreakable. In that exact instant, Victor understood he was about to hear something he could never ignore. Nick understood he was about to be exposed in the cruelest way possible. Jack understood every calculation he'd made could collapse because of one revelation. And Sienna understood her life was about to split into a direction she could never undo. Because the biggest secret might not be where Matt was hiding, it might be why Matt was still alive at all, and why Nick had needed Jack to keep him buried in the dark. And when Victor stepped forward, his eyes darkened as though he had suddenly seen a Nemean answer an act of betrayal even worse than anything he had imagined. The kind of truth that would tighten his fist so hard that one more second could drag both Newman and Abbott into a battlefield no one could escape. Victoria and Adam were never the kind of siblings who fit neatly into the same picture. They carried the same Newman blood, grew up beneath Victor's massive shadow, and were raised to believe that power was the only language capable of protecting an empire, yet they chose completely opposite ways to prove they belonged. Victoria wrapped herself in discipline, responsibility, and the image of the rightful heir to Newman Enterprises. The woman willing to absorb every wound as long as the company stayed standing and the Newman name remained untouchable. Adam, meanwhile, was the part of the family everyone tried to forget but never truly could, but the crack and the test. The reminder that the Newman machine could create people who simply did not know how to bow. He lived on defiance, on an endless hunger to be recognized, and on the instinct to walk around the front door just to prove he could find another way out. And that was why, when circumstances forced them onto the same side, it didn't feel like a simple truce between brother and sister. It felt like a ruthless trial written by fate itself, demanding they choose, keep hating each other and watch their legacy get ripped apart, or swallow every bitter memory to save the one thing that made them Newmans. The danger called Cain didn't arrive as a loud, obvious attack. It came like poisoned wind slipping through every crack in the walls. Cain didn't have to shout that he wanted Newman Enterprises' ambition was obvious in every calculated smile, every strategic meeting, every step that looked harmless until it wasn't. Cain wasn't just chasing a victory. He wanted his opponents to feel powerless inside their own fortress. And for him, Newman Enterprises wasn't merely a company, it was the symbol of absolute dominance, the empire Victor built like a fortress, the name that made an entire city hesitate. To take it, Cain understood he couldn't rely on brute force alone. He needed the fractures inside the Newman family. He needed old grudges and fragile trust. He needed private wounds to become strategic openings. And he chose his moment well when the family was already strained, when trust was thin, when everyone carried a different fear about losing their place at the table. Victoria felt that pressure first and most intensely because she stood at the front line. She was the one defending numbers, meetings, investors, public perception of every rumor that could shake the market, every whisper that could turn into panic. She refused to let herself show fear, but deep down she knew this wasn't a normal takeover attempt. This was an invasion aimed straight at the Newman legacy itself. Newman Enterprises wasn't something she would ever bargain away. And it wasn't a trophy to display, it was duty. It was the silent vow she had placed on her own shoulders when she was still young enough to learn the hardest truth. If she wasn't strong, someone else would swallow her family whole. That was why every time Cain's name surfaced, Victoria didn't just feel anger. She felt suffocated, like someone had wrapped their hands around her throat and forced her to stare at the nightmare she hated most, that Victor's empire could collapse on her watch. And history would write her name into the failure forever. Adam understood Cain's threat too, but he felt it through a completely different lens. Adam didn't see Cain the way a traditional protector would. He saw Cain like he saw a distorted reflection of himself in one crucial way. Cain knew how to weaponize chaos. Adam had lived in chaos. He had been treated like the family's internal threat, the mistake Victor never wanted to admit out loud, The shadow shoved to the edge so the rest of them could breathe easier. And because of that, when Kane targeted Newman Enterprises, Adam didn't only see the risk of losing the company. He saw the risk of losing his rarest chance to prove he belonged. If Kane succeeded, every effort Adam made to be accepted would turn to ash. He would become the scapegoat against convenient proof of collapse no matter what he did. And the most brutal part was this. Adam also knew Victoria would never fully trust him because in her mind, Adam was always a dangerous variable. The one person who might betray them the second he felt underestimated. And yet, because they both understood how high the stakes truly were, neither of them had a choice but to move closer, even though each step felt like swallowing something sharp. Victoria hated the idea of needing Adam because it made her feel as though she was losing control. She had built her identity around the belief that she could shoulder everything alone, that she didn't need Adam to protect the company. But reality was merciless. Kane was playing a massive game, and Victoria needed every possible advantage. Adam, regardless of how much resentment lived in her memory, was still an advantage. He understood the corners she refused to touch. He could see moves she would never anticipate. And most importantly, he wasn't afraid to do the things Victoria always avoided because she feared staining the Newman image. In moments of survival, ruthlessness often becomes the one thing that keeps an empire alive. For Adam, this cooperation wasn't a dream either. Deep down, he had built his entire life around standing alone around surviving suspicion, enduring judgment, being condemned before he even had the chance to prove himself. If he entered an alliance with Victoria, he knew he would always be on the edge of collapse. One mistake, one misstep, and Victoria would be the first to turn around and claim she had been right not to trust him. But Adam stepped in anyway, because this wasn't only about saving the company. It was about saving his name. If Newman Enterprises fell into Kane's hands, Adam would lose more than money or influence. He would lose the right to exist in this family narrative as a real Newman. He would become the disposable outsider again. What made this alliance explosive wasn't the decision to work together, it was the way they were forced to drag their past into every moment. Victoria and Adam couldn't pretend they hadn't destroyed each other's trust. They couldn't pretend there hadn't been betrayal, humiliation, rage, and years of wounds that never closed. Every time they occupied the same space to talk strategy, the past sat there turbulent, heavy, unavoidable. Victoria remembered the disasters Adam created, the chaos she had been forced to clean up, the way she always felt like the only adult holding the family together. Adam remembered being cast aside, treated like a mistake, shut out even while he fought desperately to belong. Those wounds didn't disappear just because Kane entered the picture. They were only temporarily buried beneath a threat big enough to crush them all. And Canacled, ambitious, Patience seemed to understand it perfectly. Kane didn't just target Newman Enterprises. He targeted the fragile unity of the Newman bloodline. He knew Victoria and Adam weren't the kind of siblings who could sit side by side and smile as if nothing had ever happened. He knew the ice between them could crack with one wrong step. That was why Kane's moves felt like pressure points designed to split them from the inside. The more the stakes rose, the more Victoria tightened, and when Victoria tightened, she defaulted to her oldest instinct: control everything, trust no one, especially the person closest to her. Adam saw it, and it made something inside him burn with bitter amusement. He felt like he was trying to do the right thing while still being treated like a traitor in waiting. He swallowed every reaction because he knew if he let his ego flare up, this alliance would collapse before Kane even delivered the final blow. Victoria was fighting herself to more than she ever wanted to admit. She wasn't afraid of Kane in the simple sense of losing to him. She was afraid of what Kane forced her to become. Kane dragged her toward the question she hated most. Could she win without turning into a colder, harsher version of Victor Simeon who sacrificed anything for control? Victoria wanted to believe she could protect Newman Enterprises with intelligence and principle. But Kane didn't play by those rules. Kane would bend laws, twist loyalty, poison reputations, and smile while he did it. And every time Victoria tried to hold on to the right way of doing things, she felt as if she was tying her own hands while the enemy sharpened his knife. Adam, on the other hand, didn't fear crossing lines. He feared something else entirely, that when everything ended, Victoria would be celebrated while he would vanish into the shadows again. He feared being the one doing the dirty work, carrying the blame, taking the heat only to be discarded once the crisis passed. Adam knew the Newman power game too well. People like Victor and Victoria knew how to write the victory story in their own names. People like Adam were often remembered only as tools. That fear sharpened his motivation into something both powerful and dangerous. Adam didn't just want to beat Cain to save the company, he wanted to beat Cain in a way that made the family incapable of denying him ever again. And when someone fights for recognition, they don't just strike at the enemy. They strike at the ick inside themselves. That was why the tension didn't come only from Cain. It came from the fragile structure of this alliance. Victoria and Adam worked together, but they didn't truly trust each other. They needed each other, but they hated the feeling of needing anyone. They defended the legacy, but they also defended their pride. And the deeper they moved into this battle, the more they realized that survival wasn't just about keeping Newman Enterprises safe. It was about keeping the family from destroying itself before Cain even finished his plan. Every choice carried two meanings, strategy and emotion. One wrong move could hand Cain the company. One right strategic move could still cost them the last remaining thread of family. And yet, strangely, their closeness in recent weeks created a tension that many people never expected, almost as if they were exhausted by the endless war between them. Not forgiveness, not peace. Something harder to define, the awareness that hatred inside the Newman family always became fuel for outsiders. Cain was living proof. When an outsider is trying to steal your house, you can't keep stabbing each other in the back and expect the walls to hold. But understanding that truth and living it were two different things. Old wounds don't heal just because danger arrives. Sometimes they hurt more because danger forces them to be seen. Cain's pressure only escalated. And with every escalation, the question became sharper, heavier, more brutal. How far were they willing to go? Would Victoria do what she once swore she never would step into the dark, sacrifice her moral boundaries, stain her own hands if it meant saving Newman Enterprises? Would Adam sacrifice his rare chance at recognition if it meant protecting the legacy that had once pushed him away? Could they bury their grudges long enough to survive? Or would the past erupt at the worst possible moment and hand Cain the win he wanted all along? The air around them grew thicker, not with noise, but with the silence that comes before catastrophe. The closer they got to the turning point, the more Victoria felt like she was walking into a war where one mistake would be fatal. The closer they got, the more Adam felt like winning wasn't enough, needed to win in a way that made the family finally see him. Those different motivations pulled them forward together, but they also carried the power to tear them apart in a single instant. And then, just as their alliance finally seemed strong enough to withstand Cain, a new, uneasy sensation began creeping in, like a clock ticking louder in a room that had gone dead quiet. It wasn't because Cain had launched a visible new attack. It was because Victoria and Adam realized the most terrifying truth of all. Cain didn't need to strike hard. He only needed to wait for the exact moment Victoria and Adam lost control of each other. One spark of pride, one flash of doubt, one split-second misstep. That was all it would take to shatter everything. And as Victoria straightened her spine, tightening her will like a vow, while Adam swallowed the storm rising in his chest, they both understood this war wasn't only against Cain. It was against themselves, against old reflexes, old hatred, old wounds waiting to explode. Because if Victoria and Adam stayed united, Newman Enterprises might survive. But if they faltered for even one heartbeat, Cain wouldn't just steal the company, he would steal the last chance the Newman family had to ever stand under the same roof again. The hook was right there, hanging like a blade. Just as they stepped into the final phase of their counterattack, the look between them shifted sharper, darker, as though both of them suddenly sensed something they had never dared to name out loud. A suspicion, a missing piece. a quiet betrayal still hiding in the background. And it was rising at the worst possible time, right when Cain was about to deliver the final blow that could turn this alliance into their salvation or the explosion that destroys them all. On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in The Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about The Young and the Restless series.